At the beginning of the 1960s, many Americans believed that they were standing at the dawn of a golden age. On January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy became the President of the United States. He was confident that the government possessed big answers to big problems, which seemed to set the tone for the rest of the decade. However, that golden age never happened. On the contrary, by the end of the 1960s, it seemed that the nation was falling apart. The Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, and in Vietnam as the Resistance War against America, was a conflict that occurred in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Beginning on November 1st, 1955, the United States entered in 1963 and remained until the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975. Communist Northern Vietnam conquered all opposing forces, including the United States, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, and other anti-communist allies. Many protests occurred in America at the dawn of the Vietnam War, one of the most significant and famous being the placing of flowers in the barrels of guns pointed at innocent people. The hippie movement began its development as a youth movement in the United States during the early 1960s and slowly developed worldwide. From around 1967, its philosophy, including harmony with nature, communal living, artistic experimentation mostly through music, and widespread use of recreational drugs like marijuana and LSD, spread around the world during its counterculture of the 1960s. This movement resulted in the emergence of rock music.
Hi, man. As a hippie from the 1960s, I enjoyed using recreational drugs like marijuana, LSD, and others. I also like to participate in peace rallies and war protests, like ones against the Vietnam War, and I like to listen to rock music like Bowie, Elvis, and the Beatles, and attend Woodstock in 1969. Peace, man.
Rock music comes to dominate the popular music charts. Elvis continues to score hits in the early parts of the decade, but music continues to diversify with folk revival and sounds of Motown. Many UK bands were at the top of the charts as well. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were prime examples of this. Also, the 1960s saw the beginning of garage bands that had been inspired by the British invasion that was kicked off by the Beatles and the Stones. The 1960s saw a change from pop love songs to the beginnings of songs that were influenced by social consciousness and political statements. Television became a major force in rock music as networks tried to attract younger audiences. Outdoor music festivals were also introduced at this time, and in 1969, Woodstock Music Art Fair drew 500,000 people to see bands play over 3 days. '60s. An average family was consistent with a mom, a dad, and 2 to 4 children. It was often a 3-bedroom house complete with kitchen, dining room, living room, or maybe a den. The thing that set the average family of the '60s from previous decades was the middle-class style of life. More and more, folks had modern appliances and conveniences like stoves, vacuums, televisions, toasters, blenders, and washing machines. All the things we consider necessary in today's standards. Not to mention, every suburban household had running water, heat, and electricity. Money was also more common during the middle class. Sewing dresses and pajamas for your children was not common anymore. Instead, you bought them from catalogs and malls. Along with clothes, families could regularly buy food and household items, which were usually produced overseas in countries like Japan. More and more households had mothers working, and this led to a higher income than usual. Many families shared similar aspects to the perfect family of the 50s. The hippie generation claimed its name after all the attention from protests and riots and concerts, and although it did play a role in the 1960s, many families still strived for that perfect family appearance. He increased the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam by a factor of over 18%. In April 1961, he authorized a failed joint CIA attempt to overthrow the Cuban government of Fidel Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion. In October 1962, spy planes discovered that Soviet missile bases had been deployed in Cuba. The resulting period of tensions, termed the Cuban Missile Crisis, nearly resulted in a breakout of global thermonuclear conflict. Domestically, however, Kennedy presided over the establishment of the Peace Corps and supported the civil rights movement. However, he was largely unsuccessful in passing new frontier domestic policies. As he did then, Kennedy continues to rank highly in historians' polls of U.S. presidents and with the general public. Sadly, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, by Lee Harvey Oswald, and Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the state crime but was never prosecuted due to being murdered by Jack Ruby 2 days later.
The struggle for civil rights had defined the 60s ever since 4 black students sat down at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in February 1960 and refused to leave. Their movement spread. Hundreds of demonstrators went back to that lunch counter every day, and tens of thousands clogged segregated restaurants and shops across the Upper South. The federal government stayed out of the civil rights struggle until 1964, when President Lyndon B. Johnson pushed a Civil Rights Act through Congress that prohibited discrimination in public places, gave the Justice Department permission to sue states that discriminated against women and minorities, and promised equal opportunities in the workplace to all. The examples of the civil rights movement inspired other groups to press for equal rights. The women's movement fought for equal educational and employment opportunities and brought about a transformation of traditional views about women's place in society. Mexican Americans battled for bilingual education programs in schools, unionization of farm workers, improved job opportunities, and increased political power. Native Americans pressed for control over their lands and resources, the preservation of native cultures, and tribal self-government. Gays and lesbians organized to end legal discrimination based on sexual orientation.